The Jets continue to make key hires on their coaching staff and in their front office, and there is a clear trend emerging that could help first-time head coach Aaron Glenn and first-time GM Darren Muji. We'll break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, February 6th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to PrizePicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Well, the Jets continue to staff up, some key hires made on their coaching staff and in their front office that we're going to break down today. And I think that there is a clear trend emerging as Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji build their respective staffs. Now, on Thursday, former Vikings general manager Rick Spielman announced on his podcast that he is going to join the Jets in a full-time capacity within the organization. He will advise Darren Muji, the new GM, and Aaron Glenn, the head coach, on roster moves. A very interesting hire, but not exactly a surprising hire, because if you go back to the Jets' search for a new coach and a new general manager, Mike Tannenbaum was kind of the lead guy, but Rick Spielman was also part of the mix. Spielman was a longtime general manager with the Minnesota Vikings. He also helped the Washington Commanders last year as they searched for a new head coach and a new general manager. But Spielman was a part of the process that brought in Glenn and Muji. And I think that he'll bring a lot of experience to the table. The Jets also announced a couple of additional coaching hires earlier in the week. One is that Charles London will be their quarterbacks coach. London was most recently Seattle's quarterbacks coach this past season. But more significantly, Scott Turner was hired as the passing game coordinator. Turner served this year as the interim offensive coordinator for the Raiders after they made some changes in season. He also, in the past, has been an offensive coordinator in this league. And I think there's a clear trend emerging when you talk about the Jets hires both in the front office and on their coaching staff. The team's defensive coordinator is Steve Wilks, who is a former head coach in the NFL. The passing game coordinator is Scott Turner, who is a former offensive coordinator in the NFL. And now in the front office, you have Rick Spielman, a former general manager in the NFL in an advisory capacity. And I think the reason this is significant is the Jets have first timers in a lot of the key spots in this organization. Aaron Glenn's never been a head coach before, first-time head coach. Tanner Engstrand, he's never been an offensive coordinator before, first-time offensive coordinator. Darren Muji, he's never been a general manager before, first-time GM. But now all three of these guys, these three critical hires, have somebody they can lean on with experience in their position. And if you go back to 2021 when the Jets brought in Robert Saleh, one of the criticisms of this coaching staff Saleh built is that it really lacked experience in a lot of areas. And a lot of people criticize Saleh for bringing in a first-time offensive coordinator in Mike LaFleur. And they said, well, now you have a first-time head coach and a first-time offensive coordinator. You have no experience there. The reality is that experience is not all it's cracked up to be. Sometimes guys are hired with little experience and they succeed. Sometimes guys have a lot of experience and they fail. But I think a fair criticism of Saleh is that it's not that he hired all these first-timers in these key roles. It's that he did not balance it out with experience in other spots in your coaching staff. If you're a first-time head coach, you don't necessarily need an offensive coordinator with a ton of experience. You can hire a first-time offensive coordinator. But what's good to do is to hire somebody who has experience in maybe a lower-level role, who can be an advisor, somebody who can kind of lead you through these decisions. Now, in fairness to Saleh, he did bring in Greg Knapp, who tragically was killed in a biking accident before the season. So in fairness to Saleh, he did do that. And, there was a tragedy. So, I do want to point that out. But across the rest of the coaching staff, there was not a ton of experience. And I think that, it's fair to look back on that and wonder, maybe should Saleh have brought in more guys with experience who could kind of be mentors to the younger, less experienced figures. I think about it in my life. We talk on this show a lot about how, in many ways, the NFL is like a distinct thing. The NFL is different from any other walk of life, but there are also areas where the NFL is kind of like, what we experience in our own day-to-day lives. And I mean, I can tell you in my life, sometimes I've been hired for a position and I've stayed in touch with my predecessor. And the predecessor can be a great sounding board because the predecessor can warn you about potential pitfalls that maybe you're not thinking about. Because whenever any of us takes a job for the first time, we think we know what we're getting into, but there are always things like we never expect. And somebody with experience can kind of point out, hey, this is something you need to look out for. But one thing I've also found is, in situations where I've been able to stay in touch with my predecessor, if a situation comes up and I'm not exactly sure how to handle it, they're a great sounding board. You could talk to them and say, well, I had a similar situation, and this is how I handled it. These were the things I did. And it's been very, very helpful to me in my career. And I think that in a situation where this works out as intended, these guys will be great resources. Spielman to Muji, because Muji's a first-time GM. He's a guy who's on the younger side. He doesn't have as much experience as your typical GM, taking over a team. Rick Spielman was a GM in the NFL for over a decade. He can be a great advisor. I like the idea of having a steady hand, somebody you can turn to, somebody who understands what you're going through, somebody who's had the job before. I think that's a really positive thing. I think, the hiring of Steve Wilks was big for the Jets for a lot of reasons. First of all, because I think Steve Wilks is a good defensive coach. But second of all, I think that Aaron Glenn kind of wants to be the CEO style head coach. So he needed a bigger name as defensive coordinator than he might have if he was going to take a more hands-on role in the defense. But third, Wilks has been a head coach in the league before. And while Wilks was not a very good head coach, while he was not a very successful head coach, if you're a head coach, you have that experience. And maybe what Wilks can provide is insight as to why things did not work out well for him. And maybe he can tell Aaron Glenn, this was one of the, these were the reasons things didn't go so well for me. So these are the things you better look out for. And then even, on the offensive side of the ball, Tanner Engstrand, first-time play caller, first-time offensive coordinator, now has Scott Turner to turn to. And Turner was a guy who was in the mix. He was a guy who was mentioned as a potential offensive coordinator for the Jets. So the Jets clearly had their eyes on him. And, look, when these things don't work well, it can be a too many cooks in the situation scenario. But I think that these moves show a clear cognizance on the Jets' part that you want to, if you're going young, there's nothing wrong with going with first timers who are full of passion, guys who, have new ideas. But you want to balance that out by having people who have practical experience in these jobs, because they can be, they can help you channel those new ideas. They can figure out which of these new ideas could work and which maybe won't work so well. So maybe it's a coincidence. I can't tell you that the Jets are doing this by design, but I think that these, on paper, these seem like really sound decisions to me. I really like the idea of the Jets going young, going with guys with new ideas, but then balancing it out at the lower level with people who have been there and done that. And, in the case of Rick Spielman, he was a pretty good GM. So a guy who's been there and done that successfully, and now maybe moving into a new phase in his career where he's willing to take a lesser role and be more of a mentor. And then, on the coaching staff, the way Steve Wilks can advise Aaron Glenn, the way Tanner Engstrand can be advised by Scott Turner. I think that, this seems to me like it could end up being the right balance for the Jets. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to departures. We've been talking about people who are arriving. There are some people departing the Jets front office. And this is a change from past transitions from general managers. And we'll go into that in more detail as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. And the live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field. And the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app today or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5 and you win if you score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com, FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Darren Muji has begun shaking up the Jets front office. Earlier in the week, the team announced a couple of departures, one of which was Greg Nejma, who was the co-director of player personnel. The other guy moving on is David Sochi. David Sochi was the senior director of football strategy for this team. And I think this is significant, not from the standpoint the Jets are making changes per se, but Nejma was a guy who was around this team for 16 years. So he survived a number of front office changes. And Sochi was the guy who managed the Jets salary cap. And when I think about recent Jets general manager changes, and when I say recent, I mean, I probably go back to 2013 when the Jets moved on from Mike Tannenbaum to John Idzik. One thing that's kind of stood out to me is the overall reluctance to make big changes in the front office. You frequently see guys in senior roles stay on. To a degree, I don't think you see in other teams when they make GM changes. Typically, when other teams make GM changes, when I follow them, they're making wholesale changes to the front office. And the Jets kind of like keep guys around. Maybe the most glaring example of that was Terry Bradway, who was a former general manager who somehow stayed with the team through two additional general manager changes. He took an advisor role when Mike Tannenbaum took over for him, and then after Tannenbaum was fired, Bradway somehow stayed on the staff after John Idzik was hired. And you've seen this over and over and over again with the Jets. And I think that, look, there's no one reason the Jets have struggled so much, but there's been a real reluctance to bring new blood in, even when the Jets change general managers. And I'm not saying that they never make changes. I'm not saying that the entire senior staff stays in place, but it just feels to me like the Jets make less of these wholesale changes than other teams when the GM goes. And, this is a good example. Like, I don't want to go in too much on the quality of anybody's work because one of the things I mentioned during the GM search is that, when you're bringing in guys who are not the decision maker, GM candidates who are like the assistant GM at their on their teams or maybe a lower level, you don't really know what they're responsible for because ultimately the only person who has the record is the final decision maker. And with the Jets, that was Joe Douglas. And before it was Joe Douglas, it was Mike McCagnon. And before it was Mike McCagnon, it was John Idzik. But it's kind of like, it kind of sticks out to me when a guy stays around for 16 years in the organization. And of course, look, every team will keep certain guys on. I don't think you'll ever see full wholesale changes. So maybe we're talking on the margins right now, but it just, maybe this is a sign that Jets are going to make a bigger transition than they typically do. And I think that's probably the right thing for this team because I do think this team needs a pretty radical transition in the way that the front office operates. So Greg Nejma is out, and look, I don't want to celebrate anybody losing their job because it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing for anybody, but especially in the league like the NFL where it's publicized when you lose your job. Most people don't. When you lose your job, it's private. In the NFL, it's you see it in the news. It's a tough thing. Look, I wish Greg Nejma well, but. I think that the Jets probably do need a bigger change in the front office than they've done in the past. And that's especially true of David Sochi. And again, I really don't want to revel in anybody losing their job, but Sochi was the guy responsible for the Jets running their salary cap. And I would say that I think that a change there is very overdue because the Jets have not run their salary cap well. In fact, outside of the New Orleans Saints, whose cap is just perennially a disaster, I don't think that there are many teams that have run their cap worse than the Jets. The Jets this past season had $62 million in dead money. And dead money is essentially, that's for past performance. That's essentially money that counts against your cap for a player who used to be there, for a player who's no longer on your team. And, dead money isn't always the worst thing in the world because, when I point out the Jets' dead money figures, people say, well, Tampa Bay had a lot of dead money a year ago. Yeah, but that dead money was for Tom Brady. That dead money was a result of them lowering Tom Brady's cap hit to fit him on the team and load that team up around him. Tampa Bay got something out of that. Tampa Bay got a Super Bowl out of that. Tampa Bay got the greatest quarterback of all time playing at a high level for them. What did the Jets get out of their dead money? I mean, if you look at the guys who had dead money for the Jets in 2024, it's not a great group of players. They had 10. Lake and Tomlinson counted 10.74 million against their cap. John Franklin Myers counted 9 million against the cap. Zach Wilson counted 8.5 million against the cap. CJ Uzama counted almost 6 million against the cap. Carl Lawson 5.8 million. Dwayne Brown 4.7 million. Jordan Whitehead 3.3 million. I mean, these are guys who didn't, most of those guys weren't very good for the Jets to begin with. And then you have guys like John Franklin Myers, who never should have been traded, who counted for dead money against the cap. And the thing that was frustrating about the way the Jets run their salary cap is that instead of getting rid of guys like CJ Uzama and Carl Lawson and just reaping the cap savings, the Jets essentially restructured their contracts to keep them on the team and push dead money hits to the future. These are guys the Jets easily could have moved on from and saved cap. Instead, they redid the deals and cost themselves money going forward. I think the way the Jets run their salary cap needs a radical change, and I think that this was a move that had to be made. And if you look at spots where I think the Jets desperately needed to make a change, I think it was definitely the guy who was running their salary cap, because part of the reason the Jets are in such a tight cap situation is the way they've managed things the last couple of years. And I understand, they were all in with Aaron Rodgers, and we can and have done multiple shows about why that approach maybe was less than ideal. But there was really no reason the Jets had to keep CJ Uzama and add him to their 2024 cap. There was no reason the Jets had to keep Carl Lawson and add him to their 2024 cap. Even Lake and Tomlinson, they restructured his contract in a way that added dead money to his cap after he was cut. Did the Jets need to structure Dwayne Brown in a way that he'd continue to cost them after he left the team? Did the Jets need to structure Jordan Whitehead in a way that he'd continue to cost them after he left the team? You lower Tom Brady's cap hit to fit him into your financial structure and keep him on the team. And then, fine, later on, you take a big dead money hit. With the Rams, okay, fine. You lowered Jalen Ramsey's cap hit so you can afford to pay him, and you add future dead money, and you deal with that then. You do it for Aaron Donald. You do it for Matthew Stafford. The Jets were doing this for guys like Tomlinson, and they were doing it for guys like Dwayne Brown, and they were doing it so that they could sign guys like Alan Lazard. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, like the idea of using dead money as a tool to fit extra guys onto your team, that's not necessarily a bad approach, but it matters who you're doing it for. You don't do it just so you can keep backup level players. You don't do it for the CJ Uzamas of the world. It was really confounding. And look, at the end of the day, Joe Douglas is the guy making the calls. So, maybe David Sochi didn't have a lot to do with it. But what I do know is that the Jets really need to change their approach for how they structure their front office and how they manage their salary cap. And I just think that this was a move that probably should have been done a couple of years ago, because the Jets have just not managed their cap well recently. And I think that this is a sign that we're going to start moving in a different direction, which is definitely a positive thing. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, Aaron Rodgers spoke to the media. It could be one of those long off seasons where we wait for a decision from Rodgers, but we'll discuss the latest of what he said as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by Betterhelp. What do you want your 2025 story to be? Every January brings a new chapter, 365 blank pages waiting for you to fill. If there's a part of your life you want to rewrite or a plot twist you've been craving, why wait? Life is not about fleeting resolutions. It's about taking control and becoming the author of your own story. Think of therapy as your personal editor, helping you to craft the life you deserve. It's not just for crisis situations. Therapy can help you develop healthier coping strategies, improve your relationships, and empower you to be the best version of yourself. Whether you're facing a challenge or just looking for personal growth, therapy is a powerful tool to help guide your journey. Whether it's learning how to set boundaries or tackling stress in new ways, therapy can help you develop skills for a better tomorrow. And even if you've never tried therapy, the benefits are clear. Finding someone to talk to and gaining fresh perspectives can make all the difference in how you navigate life's ups and downs. Write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. Let's turn our attention now to Aaron Rodgers. The Jets quarterback status for 2025 at this point is kind of up in the air. I mean, I think most of us are expecting the Jets to move on. In fact, there's a good chance Rodgers is just going to retire. Rodgers took part in a Pro-Am golf tournament in Phoenix this week. He kind of addressed his situation with the Jets. This is the direct quote. I've talked with the Jets. We will figure things out when we figure them out. So not much of an update from Rodgers. Not that you'd expect him to make any major announcements on an off-the-cuff interview while playing a golf tournament. I think really from the Jets standpoint, this situation needs to be resolved before the beginning of the new league year, because that's when you can start to trade. That's when you can start to trade for players. It's when you can begin to sign players. I don't think for the Jets standpoint, there's necessarily much of a rush. I think that first of all, it's unclear whether Rodgers wants to continue playing. And I mean, look, he may be going back into the darkness to figure that out. I've spoken extensively on this podcast about why I think the Jets should move on. I think that Rodgers' play is just not at a very high level anymore. But even beyond that, it's very difficult to envision a scenario where the Jets can compete for a Super Bowl with Rodgers in 2025. And I think it's difficult for a first-year head coach to force him to take Aaron Rodgers, because first-year head coach and Aaron Glenn, and especially in a situation like this, it's all about kind of reviving the Jets culture. And for that to happen, I think Aaron Glenn has to be the most important person in the organization. And no matter what anybody might say, as long as Aaron Rodgers is with the New York Jets, he is going to be the focal point of the organization. I don't think he's going to give up going on McAfee show every week. He's going to be the lightning rod. He's going to be the guy the media focuses on. And if the Jets had a chance to win big, the Jets had a good chance to win big, that would be one thing. Then you'd say, okay, it's worth the headaches, because I think through much of his career, Rodgers has been an interesting figure to have on your team, especially near the end of his Green Bay career. He was a guy who presented some unique challenges for his team, but as long as he was playing at an MVP level, you live with those challenges. Now that he's near the end of his career, now that he's not playing in the super high level, it becomes a whole lot tougher. And I think that it's just not a situation that's conducive for anybody. Rodgers, the last 2 years, literally everything the Jets have done has been catered to making Aaron Rodgers happy. They've brought in, they hired his preferred offensive coordinator. They brought in his preferred receivers. There were lots of personnel moves that were clearly influenced by Rodgers. The team's overall direction, I think, was influenced by Rodgers, because the Jets thought they had a short window where they could win big. And obviously they were mistaken, but they geared all of their team building towards trying to maximize these years they had with Rodgers. And we saw it did not work out. Now to turn around and have Rodgers be a bridge quarterback, I think that would be very difficult. And what happens if the Jets draft a quarterback? Is Rodgers going to be okay going to the bench if the season falls apart or he doesn't play that well and the Jets want to get a rookie quarterback some reps? I think that's a tough thing to do for a quarterback of Rodgers' stature under any circumstances. But I think it's even tougher when he's been in a scenario where he has been the absolute focal point. I just think it's a situation it would not be good for Rodgers. It would not be good for the Jets. But this process is going to take time to play itself out. And I think the first question is, does Rodgers want to continue his career? And that's very unclear right now, because this was clearly a tough season for Rodgers. This may have been one of the most difficult seasons of his career, because the Jets fell so short of expectations. Rodgers has not been part of many losing seasons. And this wasn't just a losing season. This was a losing season where the Jets were essentially out of the race in October. And Rodgers himself, his play was about as low as it's been at any point of his career. And you could tell that physically this was a tough season on him. And Rodgers was pretty vocal about the difficulty he's having, as he gets into his 40s, recovering week to week. The body just doesn't recover the way it did in his 20s or even his 30s. You saw those hits pile up. And I do think it's fair to wonder whether Rodgers was healthy at various points during the season. But the thing is, when you get older, it becomes more difficult to recover from injuries, and you get nicked up more frequently. You get banged up more frequently. So that's not a trend that's likely to reverse itself as Rodgers enters his age 41, turning 42 season. So Jets, I understand the Jets giving him space, because at the end of the day, Rodgers needs to figure out what he wants to do. Even if the Jets don't want to bring Aaron Rodgers back, which all indications are it's not going to happen, Rodgers needs to figure out whether he wants to even continue. And if he doesn't, then he can just retire. I'm sure the Jets would release him and let him sign a one-day contract with Green Bay to finish his career. If he does want to continue, then I think there's a discussion that needs to be had. I think it would be difficult for the Jets to pull off a trade with Rodgers, but it's not inconceivable. There is like maybe a small possibility. Maybe they could send him somewhere else and get a late round pick in return if he's willing to work. If he's willing to try that. Again, I'm skeptical they'd be able to pull it off, but if he's willing to work with the Jets and the Jets are willing to find, let him speak with other teams, find the best fit for him, and maybe get like a late round pick in return, if there's a 1% chance of that, it makes sense for this situation to play out, because it's, on February 6th, the Jets don't really need to have a final decision in place with their quarterback for 2025. Once we get to March, once we get into the new league year, that situation, it becomes a little bit different. Then there's some urgency that picks up. But we have a couple of weeks before the Jets really need a firm decision from Rodgers. So, I think that this process, again, Rodgers may be heading to the darkness to figure out whether he wants to continue his career. I think he'll obviously want to gauge the interest in him around the league. Is there any team that actually wants to bring him in, which is another open question. But definitely something, it's a situation that's unlikely to be resolved now, and it's unlikely to be resolved for at least a little bit of time until Rodgers and the Jets have had some time to think things through and explore the market. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast first, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.